Hello everyone, my name is Rob and I am an alcoholic. It's been by the grace of God, strong sponsorship, the actions I've learned to take in Alcoholics Anonymous, and an awesome home group that I have not had a drink since December 18th of 1996. For that I am eternally grateful. I want to welcome everyone to the Working with Others group 4th anniversary celebration of recovery. And a part of what we like to do is bring somebody in from out of town, because it always seems like if you bring somebody in from out of town, they have more authority than the guy that lives down the street. And a good friend, Tom, and he's a good friend. I had the opportunity to hear him talk in Wichita, Kansas in 1981 or 1982. And the only reason I mention that is because it's 20 years later and the man's still doing the same thing. Is that when you call him and ask him to come and talk to a group of Alcoholics Anonymous, he comes. And there was never a hesitation on his part from the time I made the phone call. He checked his calendar, he says, I'll be there. And he says, even though it's January, he says, even a southern boy like me has been able to buy a coat. So with that, I give you Tom. Aye.
Folks, thanks very much. I'm Tom Ivester, an alcoholic.
Hey, Tom!
You know it's bad news. The guy starts drinking before he even starts talking. I've been looking at that water the whole time I was sitting there. Thanks, Doug. Thanks for that history. I appreciate that. I appreciate... Oh, by the way, let me tell you, my home group is it's a synonym for the Working with Others group. I belong to the Primary Purpose group in Southern Pines, North Carolina. And I was rather gently nudged into Alcoholics Anonymous February the 2nd, 1957, and it took, it took, and I'm still here. Swear to God, I don't think I'll ever come to the place that I believe that happened, and that it's natural, and that it's real, and it got a chance of lasting. Ain't no way a guy that like me could stay sober that long. If I'd have known I was going to stay sober that long, I think I'd have quit. That's a long time. I want to congratulate the group on the 4 good years, and also the color scheme. You know what struck me? These folks went so far in decorating the room that they had a book printed to match the decor. That's great. That's just great. I really do appreciate seeing groups celebrate anniversaries, because not all groups do. And I just somehow think when we take it for granted that another year is just a routine sort of a thing, we run into some jeopardy about letting it get a little weakened down. And so I really like to make a big deal out of that. I believe in celebrating personal anniversaries. I know some folks who say they don't celebrate anniversary because they think it's an ego trip. And I always tell them that the only way it's an ego trip is if we think we did it. And if we don't think we did it, then it's a recognition of what's so true, that this truly is a we thing. And when we celebrate together, and we acknowledge together that this dude works. And it's kind of important. I'll tell you just one little story before I get going with drinking and throwing up and stuff. That just sort of brings to mind. I was speaking down in Lumberton, North Carolina one night. If you ever drive to Florida on 95, you go past Lumberton, and if you're a thinking person, you better keep going. Don't stop. I was speaking to a group there, and a young fellow came up to me after the meeting, and he said, I really wanted to talk with you because I heard you last week in Pennsylvania. And I said, well, it's okay now. I don't speak at every meeting. It'll be okay to come back some more. And he said, no, it's not that. He said, you mentioned when you spoke that it had then been 30 years and that you had been sober since your first meeting. And he said, I can't begin to tell you how important that was to me. And here's what he shared, and it's one reason that I never share my experience, promised I never would after he told me that. about being able to stay sober. He said, I was actually beginning to think something was wrong with me because I was still sober from my first meeting. Because it looked like everybody that had any sense at all was in and out like a yo-yo. And here's wimpy little old me staying sober. And I thought, my God, how important that is. Because I'm not unique. Many of us are able to come in and for whatever reason are able to grab hold of this thing and hang on to a brand new way of life. And I think that's enormously important because it does give the hope. It does give the clear example that this thing can work. I personally think that slips are an aberration. That if I work real tight and close, I personally have never seen anybody go out and drink because they OD'd on steps. Never have. Never seen anybody because they wore out on service. What I've seen is people who UD, who underdose on those things, who get into trouble. And so I think there's a real close relationship between the intimate involvement in doing the actions laid out in the program and success. And so I'm just absolutely delighted to have that experience and delighted to be here with you. And I do congratulate working with others group on the anniversary. I could spend this whole meeting just sort of eulogizing the program and greeting old friends. I've got a lot of good friends in this group here tonight, and it's great to see all my buddies. It's great to see a lot of people that I don't know. Yeah, maybe even better, we'll get to make some new friends. But that's not what we do. We're not here to eulogize. We're here to do a lot of bad drinking. Now, try not to do too much. One other thought that'll kind of bracket I guess the way I want to approach this thing. Sometimes I think, along that same line of what is it, and I can't answer the question, but what is it that causes us to have such radically different experiences in this program? There are indeed some who are able to grab onto that brass ring of sobriety when they first come in and hang on to that sucker for the rest of their lives. That's a very legitimate experience that happens to a lot of people. There are others, of whom there are many, who grab it and lose it and then suck it up and come back and grab it again and sometimes again and again. And sometimes some of these will grab it and hang on to a new life. And there's some who never do. The decor was about destroyed. Some who never do, and I don't know what the difference is. I guarantee you by the time I get finished here tonight, you'll know that mine is not based on merit or deserving or character or anything like that. I don't know what makes the difference. But I like to think about that because I never want to get to the point that I take for granted what has been given to me. And I count myself a tremendously fortunate guy to have been able to hang on to this thing, and you'll understand more why when I get into that. I also think that I'm the most rewarded man in the United States of America. And so that's really what I want to talk about, is the unlikely nature of being here and staying here, and then the payoff that comes, and I want to talk about group a little bit too. So that's an ambitious agenda. I don't really know why I'm an alcoholic. Don't even spend much time thinking about it, because what I found out is that it doesn't really matter. It's interesting to consider, and you can get all kinds of theories. They are theories that are a dime a dozen. Some of them I like, some of them I could care less for. Some that is psychological, physiological, environmental, chemical, on and on and on. There's one theory that I'm kind of fond of, that is that alcoholics just tend to not be like average people. That we tend to be a cut above just the average walking around person. We tend to be a little keener, a little sharper, quicker on the uptake, a lot more endowed with creative ability, and we just almost explode with all the talent that's just aching to get out. Some even say that we may have a slightly larger brain than the average person. I've heard that discussed for almost 46 years. Nowhere except in Alcoholics Anonymous. I never heard anybody over at Princeton researching the incredible alcoholic mind. But that's a great theory, you know, and I'll only mention, I don't know if I'll come back to it or not, but you hear that word potential. There's probably not a single alcoholic in this room who hasn't been beaten to death with, good God, you've got such potential. You could be such a winner if you just didn't drink so much. And I tell you, I've come to believe that in a way, and maybe I'll get to a little of that. So I don't really know why. I think it's the Army's fault, really. I went in the military when I was just a kid, and got off to a decent start. Went through training down in South Carolina. Hated it. I loved the Army for about 30 minutes. And then I met the first guy in charge. And I swear, I don't know what was wrong with that cretin. We were going through getting issued Army uniforms. I didn't particularly like them anyway, but they were going to give us some, and they gave us an item that I didn't recognize. And I said, what is this, pajamas? Well, that's a bad mistake in Uncle Sam's Army. They may wear them now, but they didn't then. And so he took the opportunity to demonstrate his prowess. So he said, did you hear what this yo-yo said, talking to 200 people? And, of course, nobody did except him. He said he wanted to know if this was pajamas. Well, it was long johns, what it was. And he said, what do you want next, lace panties? And it went downhill from there. I didn't like it. I went through training with 1,000 guys and was picked out as one of the 5 outstanding men in the folks that went through that. And when I was picked out, I knew that was a dumb selection. I knew that was a bad selection. I was an 8-ball of the first order. I made Gomer Pyle look like Sergeant York. The old Sergeant York, not Ollie. No, that's York. Anyway, and they picked me out. And because I had such outstanding traits, they were going to let me go to leadership training and then into OCS to become an officer. I knew that was a goof. And shortly afterward, they knew that was a goof. And so I started boozing as soon as I found town. And the true Tom showed up. And rather than going to Officers Candidate School, I wound up being stationed in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands for 25 months. Wonderful, wonderful place. Makes New Jersey look like Key West. God, I thought I was in Key West today. I was expecting to come into a blizzard, landed in Newark, and I literally said to myself, my God, the guy's got lost. This ain't New Jersey. And thank God for good weather. So I wound up there. Didn't like it. I'm telling you, I was a miserable cat. I didn't like anything about that place. I had that duty out in the Aleutians. And here I am, a fine young American who gave his life for his country. And I'm stationed on a frozen rock out in the middle of the Bering Sea or something. I don't know what it was. It was cold. That's what it was. That's the only place I've ever seen where it snowed sideways. It didn't fall like decent snow. That sucker came right flat into your face in any way you turn. Cold, Jesus. And I'm standing out there with a gun, guarding the thing. And for what? I mean, if some Russian comes over to steal the rock, I'm supposed to shoot him. I guess I'd have helped him load the thing up if he wanted to go. If he let me go with him. Well, now that's what aggravated my condition. That's the reason I say the Army caused it. I don't think they caused it, but I learned the words has been exacerbated. I think it exacerbated the problem, that it made it, speeded it up in my case, I think. I think it probably sped my progression by about 10 years. Because somewhere now I solved the dilemma of being in a place like that the way I solved a lot of the dilemmas. I got drunker than a billy goat and tried my level best to stay that way. I'd come up for air once in a while, but I didn't stay long. Because, man, most of the time I didn't know if I was in the Aleutians or Hawaii. Didn't much care, because I was unconscious a lot. And I think that did speed it up. Now, we had a bunch of folks who were the kind of pure of heart, the kind that, fine, I'm one of them now, but the kind that get out and walk even when they ain't going nowhere. They just get out and walk to walk. climb mountains. For what? Hunt stuff. God knows it's hunting us most of the time, and they get out and hunt the stuff. Climb glaciers. I mean, pure folks. Eat, we didn't have tofu back then, but they ate stuff, whatever it was. We shipped a whole boatload of them home one time talking to themselves. Went crazy as a bedbug. That is no place to be sober. Nobody got any business sober up there. The old drunks are laying up there fat and happy. So I think it speeded it up. And that sort of was characteristic of my life. I just sort of took off. I just got into a pattern of screwing up everything I touched. I thought when I first got in AA, I must have been born alcoholic because I acted like one. The first time I ever drank, to the untrained eye, it would appear that I drank too much, but I always thought I drank just about the right amount, all I could get. And I really don't think I was born alcoholic. I might have been tilted in that direction, but I think some things have to settle in for alcoholism to become a very real illness. So I think what I was a guy that was a sort of a miserable cat. I didn't fit well in the world. I was uncomfortable around people. I didn't relate well to folk. I was a very isolated guy. And I always resolved those conflicts by acting the opposite. And so when I drank, man, I was like a guy, no mystery why I drank. It freed me from the prison of my life and let me come out and have a good time. It let me play with anybody. And I just absolutely loved the feeling of the freedom that came, that relaxation, that comfortable thing that came. I loved the style. I took up drinking as a way of life. It didn't matter whether it was alcoholic or not. I just liked the drinking environment. I loved where people drank, how they drank. I liked what they did when they drank, unless they did it to me. And some of that, it was a strange kind of a deal. Loved it. Loved a smoky jazz club on well, shoot, I talk myself into it if I get to reliving that too much. I just loved it. It was just a natural kind of a thing for me. And I tell you, I would be doing that today had it not been for one thing. I developed alcoholism. It occurred somewhere during that foggy period up in Alaska in the Aleutians, don't know when. And never had a clue about it until I was sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. But when it started to become clear to me that something had happened that put me in trouble with booze, I was sober in AA for a good while. I never had a clue about that until I was here. But when I look back, I could recognize that even though it was a foggy picture, I could see that at some point I experienced what we call crossing a line. Now, you don't find it written anywhere. It's just sort of an old saying that's come up because it tends to describe. And when I look at the drinker that I observed, that fellow, it was kind of wild, celebrational, recreational, whoopee kind of drinking that just, I loved an endless party. But there was a point where the character of the drinking changed, not the amount. I drank as much as I could before I was alcoholic. When you get so drunk you can't lay on the floor, that's about as good as you can do. I don't care whether you're alcoholic or not. Man, I've been so drunk I couldn't blink, stuff coming out my nose, you know, and you never thought I had enough. But something happened in that if I took a drink, I could not predict how long I would drink or how much I would drink, nor could I predict what I might do. And that became the story of my life. A guy that just, when I drank, something happened. I don't understand all that happened to me. And like I said in the beginning, I don't really spend a lot of time on that. I find it relatively interesting, but almost totally unimportant to study the wherefores of alcoholism, almost totally unimportant in terms of my recovery. It doesn't really matter how it happened. I'm not the village idiot, so I've got some kind of notions about it, but I don't take it very seriously. The most important thing that I know about alcoholism is that I have it, wherever it came from. And so when I look back, I could see that there was something happened to me that I don't understand, but it was basically like this, that if 10 people take a drink, 9 of them go on about their business. One of them doesn't. And I happen to be that one. And whatever it is, I don't know. But from the time I crossed that line, I think my future was predictable to anybody but me. And I lived in I really liked the thing Ken read, that I heard it several times in what he read, that you hear the word delusion that comes out in that. You know the words you'll never hear when you read that book is denial. You'll never hear it. It isn't in there. And obviously not because Bill didn't know the word. I think that guy knew every word in every language. But it certainly wasn't that. I don't think he used the word because I don't think it aptly describes the condition. Delusion is a different thing. Because what started to happen to me when I crossed that line, developed alcoholism, is that, I'll just sum it up in a hurry because I do want to talk about some other stuff. And what started to happen was that I would start winding up in ever-increasing jackpots of all sorts. Wake up in a psych ward because somebody thought I acted peculiar. In a hospital with stuff broken that I didn't even know was injured. In jail with sickening regularity. God, that got to be a norm. Every time somebody mentions Kansas, this is not Kansas, Doug. This is New Jersey to the hilt. Every time somebody mentions Kansas, I remember December the 28th of 1951. That was the day that I was picked up off the floor of the Junction City, Kansas jail and taken into the base to be ceremoniously discharged from the military with an undesirable discharge for alcoholism. A 21-year-old budding rocket scientist, and that was, well, I always think of that when I think of Kansas. But what my life became was just that endless series of waking up in strange places. I won't go into a whole bunch of them because, God, I mean, some of them are funny after about 10 years. Blackouts don't get funny for a long time. I don't know of anything more terrifying in the annals of alcoholism than blackouts. That thing of waking up, I don't need to tell you about it. Many of you understand blackouts, and the only time you understand them is when you've experienced it. To wake up with that panicky feeling of, for God's sakes, where am I? What have I done? You know, and that horrible feeling of uncertainty till you start to get the clue. You know, our book describes it pretty vividly in one place. In fact, I used to think it was a little bit of overkill, where they referred to the condition I'm talking about as pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. And for a long time when I read that, I always kind of thought in the back of my mind, old Bill got a little carried away with describing a hangover. Until I started to clearly see what happened when I would crash somewhere. And no matter where it was, in a wrecked car, in the wrong straight, woke up one time married to a woman I didn't even know, for God's sake. That takes bad liquor to do that to you. But that's what it became, and that endless series of stuff. And every time I would wake up, even though I didn't think it out at that time, but when I look back, clearly, what would happen every time was pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization, because I'd take a look, and when I finally figured out where I was, you know, that panicky feeling, and then I got to a point, just to illustrate, was if I heard metal clanging, I relaxed. Because I knew I was in the right place. And nobody ever put me in jail by mistake. At least they wouldn't admit it. And nobody ever apologized for it. That's for doggone sure. And sometimes it was not all that pleasant. I'll just tell you one. I woke up one morning, one of many. I woke up one morning or came to, and I'd gotten to a point where I was greeted often enough with really a bunch of folk who didn't understand. And as soon as they'd see my eyes open, they'd pounce on me. You know, what are you doing here? You hate to say, where? Or, who are you? Well, you may not remember, and if you do, you may not be sure what name you've used, you know. So they're rude people that just sort of greet you that way. So I would wake up and never show evidence. You know, I mean, I wouldn't open my eyes. And so I would just come alert, you know, sort of. And I lay there still listening for the sounds of the environment. One morning I woke up and there was a maddest woman I think I've ever heard in my life. God, she was mad. And she was just having an enormous hard time with some drunken SOB in her daughter's bed. Well, I just had that brilliant alcoholic mind told me that there was a chance she was talking about me. I just figured that, 'cause I knew I wasn't home. And now, a drunk can lay still. I mean, I was still, man. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I'm just laying there. And I'm trying to figure out, number one, where I am, and number two, how do I get out of here? You know, 'cause I didn't want to go past her. And so when I saw my chance, I saw a little crack in the door, and so I just bolted out the door. Well, it wasn't as bad as it sounded. It was the house next door to mine. That ain't bad. Yeah, man, I usually missed it by whole state. I was kind of proud of that. I almost got home. Well, it was that kind of stuff. And so every time that would happen, my response would be that pitiful incompetence. And it would be always something like this. You've done it again. You've done it again. You're no good. That moral whipping. You're worthless. You have no discipline. You have no responsibility. You got absolutely sorry, as we say down in North Carolina. And that was probably all applicable at that point. And then would proceed the options. I'd start thinking. And number one would always be, why don't you just end it? Why don't you just end it all? Everybody would be better off. And I wouldn't debate with that today. Or, if not that, did you ever have the thought of, I think I'll just keep going, I'll just disappear, I'll just go on and just not bother anybody anymore, just sort of walk off into the sunset? An appealing kind of an illusion that comes out of that delusion. And if not that, do I suck it up and go back and make up another set of lies and try it again? That was a routine that went on not once, not a dozen times. That went on time after time after time. Now let me tell you what was peculiar and a point I started to make with that. What Ken was reading. I never clearly saw that behavior. I never clearly saw that until I was sober a good while in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's a delusion. The book calls it an inability to differentiate the true from the false. And when I was in that kind of condition, the real world looked like it was behind a dark screen. That world that I was in was the only one that had tangibility. And so that delusional world of not being able to see my own behavior, and I never saw that until I was clear in Alcoholics Anonymous and cleared up. And so that thing just proceeded on. I did very well. I was mentioning about potential. I was always the kind of guy that if I was sober, I made a pretty good impression. I always did. It's some of what you were reading there about that even in our kindness or even in our best times, there's always something underneath. I was the kind of guy that when I was sober, I looked like a world beater. I'd go in and I'd look for a job. People would hire me for a better job than I'm looking for. They put me in charge of something. All I want to do is pick up a box or something, and then they put me in charge. And then I'd work my way down. I never had a promotion in my life that I can recall. And so I had that kind of an ability, that innate potential or something to look good, but an unfailing ability to take a drink at exactly the wrong time. And so it just screwed up. And then incrementally I just kept working my way down. And in 8 short years, really, it's a short period of time. It didn't seem like it then, but it was a short period of time. I went from a fellow who bounced out of high school in North Carolina at 16, and then the fellow who went through the military, thrown out, and then wound up in the state of Michigan building automobiles. When I guess that's what I was doing. They accused me of it anyway, but I didn't know much about it. And then in a city of 500,000 folks, I wound up unemployed and darn near unemployable. I won't go into detail, but the last quasi-legal job I had was I ran a place called Eddie's Lounge. And that was a very euphemistic term for that. It was quasi-legal at best. We sold a lot of stuff in there, some of it on the counter. Well, Well, anyway, it's a nice young boy like me. That would have not have been on my resume of places that I would go. And I was fired, of course. I was the drunkest guy in the place. Had to be. Jesus, I couldn't have stood that sober. And then hit the street in the last couple of years. I just basically lived essentially on the street. I was my most frequent address was either the county jail, or they had a movie theater called the Rialto, and a good friend of mine just died, and he and I had a wonderful time. He got sober, and he was in the same environment I was. We drank together. I always accused him of stealing my shoes in that movie theater, and we had fun with that for 30 years, and he was just killed in a plane crash very recently. But funny about the survivors and how they cling together, eh? Well, and that was where I wound up, just living a kind of life that I honest to God, didn't even know existed. When I grew up in Mayberry, man, I didn't know the world was like that. But I was well accustomed to it. It's funny when you go down that the change is so subtle, or I guess I'm so groggy, that I didn't even recognize how bad it was till it was over. I wound up where at what at one time would have been a totally unthinkable way for me to live became the only normal way for me to live. Remarkably normal. It was not it was surprising in a way, but when I started thinking about it, I was sober for a pretty good while before I ever started thinking in terms of decency or quality. You know what I mean? I was the kind of guy that would just instinctively reach out for the inferior, because that was what my life had become, was just automatically thinking in those second-rate terms. And recovery doesn't lead to a second-rate existence. It leads to some real life with integrity and purpose. And so, but that's where I wound up. And it would be nice if I could tell you that one fine day I had enough and called for help, found it, and never sinned again. But it just didn't work that way. Yeah, I was one of those guys who wound up doing, many of you are well aware in here, but I was one of those guys who wound up doing the kind of thing that I know every alcoholic in the world fears doing. Thank God most don't. But some of my dear friends in here have experienced the same thing. And I woke up to the horror that makes blackouts so terrifying. It's that unknown quality of, good God, what have I done? And so I'd had hundreds of times when I'd wake up and I'd be confronted with the terror, and it would always be useless terror. One morning I woke up in jail there in Flint, nothing new about that, and was greeted with the fact that the night before I had run down and killed 2 people in the street of that city. And there's no way to imagine, it's impossible to imagine the impact of that. I couldn't even describe it adequately. It's just, I believe that the mind only accepts what it can handle. And my response was just basically to push it away and say, no, no, no. And then gradually accept the truth. The only time I'd ever been in jail, didn't try to get out. And then somebody, one of the policemen there, I think, learned that I had family in North Carolina. I had a mother and sister, and they contacted them and told them they had a guy up there in a lot of trouble. And so they came up, and I didn't want to get out of jail. I was ashamed to get out of jail. I couldn't even fathom the thought of facing anybody. And but I didn't know how to say that to anybody. I was just a withdrawn guy, just absolutely backing away from any semblance of life. And so they came up and they got an attorney, negotiated my release on bond. I was charged with manslaughter, and I was released July 17 of 56. I knew that I would not drink. I mean, my God, how could you drink after something like that? The more appropriate question is, how could you not drink after something? But I didn't know that. I had no earthly idea about alcoholism, but I just know I got out, stayed sober a day and a half by walking the streets, and then I started to drink, of course. And from July to November of 56, I drank literally like nobody I've ever seen. I have worked with many thousands of alcoholics. Held a guy in my arms while he died one time. And even he was not in the frame of mind that I was. I was a guy that just gave in the condition. I have absolutely no doubt, even then, that I was trying to drink myself dead. That was obvious. I mean, a wino could have diagnosed me. And And so that went on just big time from till the 19th of November. On that day, I had about that much in a bottle of gin, and went to court. There was no trial. I had no defense. I mean, the hell of a blackout is you're not a witness to your own behavior. So I couldn't testify anything, and so they held it. I was, of course, found guilty and sentenced to a max of 15 years in the Michigan State Penitentiary. Now, that was, I mean, I knew I was going away. There was no shock about that, but there's something about the shock of the reality, I think, because my response when that reaction, I guess, when that judge passed that sentence, I had an instinctive reaction of fear, I guess a very normal thing. And almost simultaneously, the most real sense of relief I'd ever known, because I knew it was done. It was over. Not optimism, not hope, not a future's coming. I knew it was done. It was all over. And I walked into that place the next day. I did walk in, but I was chained with 5 other guys, and we walked into to that institution. At that time, and I think it probably still has the honor, if you can call it that, it was the largest walled institution in the world. At 54 acres behind a 40-foot wall, and I knew when I walked in to that thing, it's just a chain of human misery that walks into places like that. And most folks come out of there worse than they went in. And so I knew when I went into that place that I would never come out of there alive. And I, honest to God, didn't care. I mean, I was past caring. I was past concern or fear. I was just into total isolation. And they put me in. I sat in a cell for the first month that I was there. Did anything I could do to keep from thinking. And it's amazing to me, the little things that make a difference. I don't know what happened to everybody. I listen closely when people talk about what happens to them, but it's amazing the little things that come to be turning points. I'd had a lot of turning points in my life, always turned the wrong way. But when things started to turn the right way, and I look back, it was amazingly simple stuff. One of the things that happened, the guy, sometime during that first month I was there, called me out for an interview. And I'm sure a lot of people did, gave me MMPIs and all that kind of stuff. And this guy called me out, did a little social work interview. And he'd asked the questions he was trained to ask, and I did the answers I was trained to give. I lied like a dog, I'm sure. I mean, I didn't have to make up a lie. I just instinctively lied. That was a natural day. It would have been abnormal for me not to lie. And apparently the answers don't have a lot to do with the evaluation, because he did what they taught him in college. If you see a guy who's got a file like that and it's all about drunk, you ought to tell him he ought to go to AA. Well, now, I'd had a lot of people tell me when they would have me up against the wall over my drinking that I was alcoholic or drunk or bum or what have you. I'd heard that forever. But I had never had anybody suggest what you did about it. Some would say, why don't you quit? And I never could think of any good reason to quit. Only people I ever saw who quit looked like they'd quit something. None I wanted as a role model, that's for sure. And drunk was bad enough. My God, imagine sober. And so this guy laid that stuff out, and he said, "You've had a lot of trouble with booze?" I said, "Oh, yeah." And then he said what I'd never heard before. I don't remember if he said AA or Alcoholics Anonymous, but he said, "We've got an AA group here at the institution, and I think you ought to go." It was just a flat conversational kind of thing like that. It wasn't. It didn't capture me like we do nowadays. They didn't put a noose on me and say, if you don't go, we're going to slam dunk you or something. That just said, you ought to go. And then I got a little piece, looked like an old telegram. I got a piece of paper about like that. And it said, you're cleared to go to your first meeting, February 2nd of 57. I didn't particularly want to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't believe I was an alcoholic. How could you possibly be an alcoholic at 24 with so much potential? Yeah, I'd had folks tell me I had a lot of potential. And I never forgot it. Had a lot of folks tell me I was a worthless bum, but I promptly disregarded all that. But this, I didn't believe I was an alcoholic, not whatsoever. That was a totally foreign term to me. But for some reason, that day came, February 2nd. I walked into my first meeting. I didn't want to join AA. I was the only. If I had any drive or any ambition at that point, it was to disappear. I just simply, I didn't want to engage with anybody. I've never been more isolated in my life. I didn't communicate with anybody. I had no conversations with anybody about anything unless they asked me a direct question. And I think the only reason I went to that first meeting was that I was just beat. I was just absolutely beat. I had no resistance. I couldn't even put up a fight. And so I walked in. One guy spoke to me. They had about 300 folks in that group. Became my home group. It'll always be my home group, the recovery group at Jackson Prison. Now, I don't want to be a regular member, but isn't it funny how the place where it works for you is always important, no matter where it is? There's little that folks could ask you to do at that place you wouldn't do. Yeah, I go back every couple of years, every chance I get, I go back up to Jackson. Now, everybody I knew there's dead. Yeah, I'm the only thing living, I believe. And I go back, don't know anybody, but oh boy, I know where I am. And I go back to make sure, number one, that I ain't there, and the other is to maybe say something to the guy who is, you know. And so, has a bit of a purpose, you know, kind of a, I won't go into it, but I had a chance one time to, I didn't ask for it, but I was up there visiting, and somebody said, would you like to see your old cell? And I said, geez, that'd be nice, you know. And so we went, I'll just tell you this much of it. We went over that block. I'll tell you, it's a funny thing when you retrace your steps, eh? You ever go back to a place where somebody's telling me about how Frank gives directions to somewhere, that you better listen close, because what he does is tell you all of his drinking spots, and by the way, a street name somewhere. You know, it's funny, isn't it, when you walk back over your own history, and particularly if it's one where your life hung by a slender, slender thread. So we walked out on the yard. Now, I had private thoughts. I didn't get in conversation with anybody, just private thoughts. You know, naturally, they had special meaning to me. I remember walking across that yard when that was where I lived and knew that's where I would die. Walked across a yard where every second of every day was filled with tension and anxiety. About everything, about nothing. Where man's inhumanity to man was normal. Where sincerity was looked at as stupidity. Yeah. Private thoughts, you know, as we walked along that place. Went into that cell block. And it's funny what you notice, you know, when we walked in. It's an old penitentiary, and the brick stairs that go into the dorm to the block were worn, you know. And I just sort of mentally calculated how much I contributed to that groove. Yeah, that was my groove. It went up. My address, if you can call it that, was 3938. That meant I was cell number 39 on the third tier. It's cell block number 8, and we walked in. A nice young correctional officer showing us in. And we walked up, and he walked over in front of a cell, and he said, "This is it." And I said, "What?" He said, 39, wasn't that your cell? And I said, "Yeah, but that ain't it." And he, "Well, it is." See, right here, he's arguing with me. And I said, no, man, you guys have rigged something. And he said, "Well, where is it?" Like I wouldn't know. Well, good God. And I looked right, they all look exactly alike. But when you lived in that sucker and was convinced you'd never come out of it, you don't forget. So I looked down, and I said, "That's it." Went down, there was a young fellow, I'll tell you more than I meant to, but it's just intriguing to me that went down, and it was Saturday night in a penitentiary, in a maximum custody joint. It was either bedlam or tomb-like silence on Saturday night. Normally it's tomb-like silence with an occasional yell that has no connection to anything. And so we walk in. Now, 3 suits walking in there on Saturday night is bad news. I mean, you know narcs or FBI or somebody is in town. And walk up to 39, and so we're looking in. A young fellow named Collins was in there, and the officer said, "You want to go in?" And I said, "Is it all right?" To Collins, I said, "Is that all right?" He said, "Yeah, go on in." So I opened the door, I went in. Well, I realized, this is pretty shocking that somebody's going to come barging into your cell on Saturday night in a max joint. And I said, look, Mr. Collins, I'm sorry to bother you, but you see, I used to live in this cell. and I just wanted to come by for old time's sakes and take a look at it. Do you mind? He said, hell no, I don't mind. You can have this sucker if you want. I said, oh no, buddy, it's your time. It's your time. And we chatted just a couple of minutes. But what a feeling, eh? What a feeling, you know, to go back with a totally different life and look at that same place with new eyes. So it's a strange thing about how it works. And so I walked into that first meeting. Not a clue of becoming an AA member, not a clue of staying sober for the rest of my life, not a clue of anything. I was like a guy on Thorazine. I just kind of shuffled in, just with no real meaning or purpose. Just they said to be there, I'd have been there. If it had been the Russian infantry, I'd have probably done the same thing. And so I walked in, sat down. Little did I know that was to be a turning point. I certainly didn't recognize that day. I walked in to the recovery group. And they conducted a meeting similar to this. Read different stuff, but read a lot of it. They prayed. I knew they were going to do that. Ain't no way you're going to work with drunks without praying, so I knew they'd pray some. And then they turned the speaker loose. And he was a guy named Shy Walker, marvelous man. And he got up and told his story. And I tell you, that was not that day, but that man getting involved in my life was one of the turning points of my life. Because he told his story, and I didn't identify with him. He was as different from me as anybody I've ever met in my life. Different man, a little short, beat-up little old guy, about a third-grade education, just one of life's simple, down-to-earth people. He was an ex-boxer, and I tried that for a while, and I was not good at it. They kept putting me in there with people big as me, and they were knocking my eyes out. And Shy was a boxer. And apparently he wasn't much better than I was, but he stayed longer. And that poor boy got beat up something fierce. Marked up. You didn't need to ask him what his hobbies were. You could tell. But I listened to that guy tell his story. And now it didn't connect with me whatsoever. The amazing thing, I was back the next week. And the only thing that brought me back the next week was that magical enthusiasm that was part of that guy's life. He was one of the most alive, dynamic people. I absolutely treasure enthusiastic people because I think it's a healing force. I think it's a powerful force for when we talk about this program being a program of attraction, we're not talking about the stuff on the wall. The program of attraction is how I interact with my fellow alcoholics. That's the program of attraction. And I've seen very few people attracted with gloom and doom. And so I'm a great believer in the value of enthusiasm and demonstrating that there's actually life after recovery. And thank God for that guy, because now I could not have even thought that then. But I reacted to it. I responded to it. And I found myself back the next week. Couldn't have told anybody why I didn't have to. Kept going back. I was in AA. I was as miserable as anybody I've ever seen, and as out of place as any place I've ever been in my life. Now I was a young guy back then. Still think I am, but I was a real young guy then. 24 by today's standards is not very young. By 1956 and 57 standards, that's young. And I was the youngest member in that entire group. I was the youngest guy in that penitentiary, so I was obviously the youngest one in that group. They didn't keep me in there because I was Charlie Manson. I was just so wild and crazy when I drank that they knew that it'd be high risk to put me in any day. I stayed in Max the whole time I was in there. And so I was tremendously out of place. I didn't feel like I belonged. I said I was an alcoholic because I hated to be the only one out of 300 that was something else. And they all said they were. I said, yeah, me too. You know, but it didn't mean a thing. It was just a word. And I kept going back. There were some subtle but important things happen. I won't take the time to dwell on it this much, but one reason that I'm a strong group man. And when I say group man, I'm talking about a purposeful, well-structured group that has a design for living that's well laid out. I believe in that because that is where I was the kind of guy who never trusted a human being. When you operate on the streets, trust doesn't even get into the dialogue, never mind into the character. It just doesn't get in. And so I had never met a human being that I believed offered something that didn't have a hook on it. Never did. I didn't believe anybody did anything for nothing. And the first place, the first place that I ever learned to trust another person was in that maximum custody penitentiary AA group. Amazing thing. 300 guys that were, by their own definition, almost unbelievable in terms of some of the things they had done. And I watched those same people perform acts of integrity and honesty and consideration that were almost unbelievable. So individually, I started to see some of the power of the program, and then collectively, that group did a magnificent job of helping new people understand that Alcoholics Anonymous, recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous, is not some mystical thing that happens to a fortunate few. That's not what this is. This is not some bolt out of the blue. The guys in that joint, and they were not Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, they were guys who had found something. And they helped me to understand. They taught me that Alcoholics Anonymous is a design for living. It's not some heavenly magic show. It's a design for living. And if I will take the actions as laid out in those 200 words of the 12 steps, something will happen to me that'll make me a dramatically different person. And boy, is that ever true. And I will always be grateful for that. For a good, strong, solid group that's stuck to the purpose, like you were talking about, that deals with the solution. And so that was the place that somehow that kept tantalizing me back. Now, I've always been a reader. I read everything we had. We didn't have too much back then. Bill wrote half of it. But we had a few things, about 12 items altogether. And I read the stuff, and I'll tell you where a major turning point came for me. I don't like to over-glamorize anything about recovery. If somebody asks me what's the most important step, I say, all 12. It's a way of life. It's not individual hopscotch. It's a way of life. And but a huge turning point for me was in that first period, that 8 or 9 months. I had a sort of an intellectual grasp. I had come to believe there was a power that I felt in the group. I had some sort of fleeting holds on things, but I think I could have been knocked over very easily. And then something happened that was a transforming thing in my life and in my recovery. Went to a meeting one day. The speaker spent the entire meeting on the 4th steps, all he talked about. Read part of it, illustrated part of it. Went back to my cell when it was over, and I said, okay, I'm going to do that. Now, I had read the stuff. And what I meant to write was a little story about how such a nice guy as me got in such a mess. It is really what I meant to do, which isn't quite an inventory. The founders were wise when they said to write the inventory. They were wise. Because I started to write, I wrote 2 lines of what I had in mind, and then with absolutely no intent whatsoever, all at once it was like I hit a wall. And the delusion started to end. It started to end. All at once, nothing dramatic. It was dramatic in hindsight. But I started to write, wrote 2 lines, and then all at once, I guess I saw the charade, didn't think about it, just responded to it, and in one motion, stopped that foolishness and opened up and poured out my heart and wrote my first inventory. Now, it was a crude-looking thing. If you were going to look at it and compare it to the columns and all of the evaluations and what Brown did to Jones and all this stuff, if you measured it by that, it would look very crude. But don't underestimate. You can't screw up an inventory if you do it to the best of your ability when you sit down there and put it on that paper. You can't screw it up. And what I did that day was open up and pour out my heart. When I got through, I had 3 pages of scribble. Nobody could have read it. Nobody was supposed to. I tell you what it was the most important day's work this old boy has ever done in his entire life, bar none. More important than the day I married, the day my son was born, my daughter. More important than when my career started or finished was the day that I did that thing, because what happened then, talk about impacting the delusion. When I got through with that inventory, I knew I knew at a cellular level that I was alcoholic. Not the young case, not the tragic case, not the whiz kid. I knew I was alcoholic, period. Period. I have never doubted that for 1 second to this day. I'm absolutely convinced that what happens in Alcoholics Anonymous in recovery is critically attached to that. If I don't experience surrender at depth, then I'm not going to do the things full bore that follow. We grow out of it. This program's not about achievement or attainment or education or stuff like that. It's about surrender and opening to something new. And that's what happened. Our book says it a lot better than I could, where it says something like this. I can't quote nothing and no page numbers. But somewhere in the 3rd chapter, it says something like this. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. It's the first step in recovery. That sounds simple, doesn't it? Had to concede to my innermost self. It doesn't matter what I say to you. I told you I was Tom Ivester. I'm an alcoholic. I am. That's not what that step's talking about. What that's talking about is conceding at depth. I'm a guy who is whipped. I'm a guy who is beat. I'm a guy who has alcoholism. I'm not a bad drunk. I'm not a street grifter. I'm a guy who has alcoholism. There's something constitutionally different about me than other drinkers that are not alcoholic. I don't care why. I just know that that's a fact. And the great thing is, when I accept that at the core of my being, fellow alcoholics, the fight's over. It's over. I haven't revisited that fight not one time since. Now, I've come close to drinking because I have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I haven't had a lobotomy. I still have that sucker. And it is, as our book describes it, a mind that can turn at times irresistibly to the thought of a drink. Mine has. And thank God, the good news is that the program we celebrate tonight is more powerful than the illness. If it weren't, I wouldn't be here. And so that was fundamental to me. What other thing happened that day, when I finished that inventory, I became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have never been just another link on that chain of human misery since. I took a place in Alcoholics Anonymous. I've never been to a single meeting without knowing 100% why I'm there. I'm not here to entertain. If we have a good time, good. But I'm not here for that. I'm not here to teach. I'm here to share from the depth of my experience in the hope it can mean something to somebody else. But I never get carried away with what my purpose is, nor misunderstand my fundamental thing. I'm a man on a mission. I'm here because this is what makes a difference in my life. Not only in survival. Good God, I can almost take that for granted. I haven't had a crisis for a long time now. Don't minimize that. But what I found is that if I'm caught up in doing the active work of this program, I don't even get time to think about me very much. I'm too busy enjoying the stuff that happens. So that was a fundamental turning point for me. And from then on, it was just a matter you could talk for a week about the rest of the thing. I really like the way it's summed up in that. You hear it every once in a while now, and I think it says it so well in that preface to the 12 and 12, where, and it's like I said a while ago, that our steps, the steps of the program, the way it says in there, simple sounding stuff, our steps are a set of principles, spiritual in their nature. Tell them what steps are. They're spiritual principles. And then listen to what it says, which if practiced as a way of life, not studied or worked or done or seminared or retreated, all of those things can be helpful. But listen to what it says, which if practiced as a way of life can do two things. One, it will expel the obsession to drink. Now mine is expelled. I haven't had an obsession for a long time, but it ain't far away. I can revisit that sucker with this alcoholic mind in a heartbeat. Because what I have is what? A daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of my spiritual condition. It's my fervent belief that the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the recovery program, lasts as long as I do it and not another second. And when I quit doing it, then I start to deteriorate, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. But I will deteriorate. And so that's what it gave me, was a brand new life, that it'll expel that obsession and then enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. God, is that ever true? Is that ever true? And I got to start heading for the airport pretty quick. I'm going to quit here. I've got to get you out of jail. I've already got you out in a very real sense of the word, because I tell you the power of this program. Everything that's embodied in what I was just talking about will enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. Happened to me in a maximum custody penitentiary. I became happily and usefully whole. I became a free man for the first time in my entire life in a maximum custody penitentiary. I developed real, genuine self-esteem and worth and value and purpose in a maximum custody penitentiary. I had a transforming change, and it was an amazing thing to me about what happens when this change becomes real. I was recommended for special parole 2 years after I was in there. Didn't make it, but I was recommended. And I didn't realize what an honor that was. That happens once out of 10,000 cases. And all I'm doing is practicing these principles as a way of life. Nothing outstanding. Or is it? Amazing stuff happened. And I tell you, probably the best way I could describe it, the night before, now I tell you, I hated prison. I absolutely hated it. As much as I've been around them, you wouldn't believe that, but I absolutely hated prisons. And the day I walked in there, I had some people tell me that I would get used to it in time. Well, it takes a whole lot longer than I put in to get used, because I was less used to it the day I walked out than I was the day I walked in. Absolutely hated that thing with a purple passion. But the night that I knew I was leaving the next day, and I didn't tell anybody this, but I found myself thinking, geez, I need one more day. I got a lot of AA stuff that I got to get wrapped up, you know. And if now I didn't tell anybody, because I wouldn't have put in another second. I know it's important work, but there are other members there. I said, maybe they'll handle it. And, but isn't that something, that a maximum custody penitentiary, that prison didn't change. But you hear what I'm saying? No, this is not circumstantial. You know, the freedom isn't harnessed by my limitations, physical or whatever they may be. The freedom that comes from this is a person freed. And I've never been more free in my life. I've never been more richly blessed in my life than I was then. And so when I hit the street, it was just a matter of just keeping on doing what I was doing. All I did was change. Now, I make it sound simple. It was a big deal. But in a very real sense, it wasn't. I was a strong member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Went into my little old town, and if we were doing a workshop on groups, I'd tell you a whole lot about that. But when I went into that group in the little town I was in, AA was just hanging on by an eyelash. And first meeting I went to was the worst meeting I ever been to in my life. If we'd have had a meeting that bad in the penitentiary, somebody would have got hurt. There's no way you're going to put up with that. But it was pitiful, but I dug in and started to be a part of that thing, and the thrill of seeing a group grow. When I moved away from that town 2 years later, there were 60 members in that. And I didn't do that by myself, but I helped. I guarantee you that. I 12-stepped enough drunks to populate the army, and had a wonderful time. Had my license restored 2 months after I was out of the penitentiary. Unbelievable thing to happen. Got immediately active in penitentiary work. The second week I was out, somebody asked me to go back over to the prison and carry the message, and I just got out, not the same one. And so I went and set up what's going on now for almost 43 years in that. Amazing thing. 2 years, I got to tell you this because folks will get on me if I don't. 2 years after I was out, I was sitting home one day minding my own business. I was working in a mill on the third shift, 10 at night, 6 in the morning, and was AAing like a young wild man. Man, I was AAing up a storm. And I got a phone call from the state capitol. A guy identified himself. I recognized his name. He had visited the AA group I sponsored one time, and so I acknowledged who he was, and he said, "Mr. Iverser, we are expanding the rehabilitation program in our prison system, and we were wondering if you would consider accepting a position." And at first, now there had never been an ex-con in history hired in anything like this. And I mean, it wasn't even a fantasy for folk. It was just something that didn't exist. And so he said, I said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, we know. We probably know you better than you know yourself." And I said to him from up here, truly, I never even considered it, but I said, "I'd rather do that than anything I could imagine." And down deep, you know what I said. Ain't no way. I mean, that ain't going to happen, but it did. And I went to work and then put in a 39-year career in correction. I retired 2 years ago. And it was a phenomenal career. I started out as a rehab officer and then started getting kicked up and into management. And then one day the head of our system asked me to stop by his office. He had a little assignment he wanted me to do. And normally that meant go make a speech for him somewhere. So I went by and he said, "Tom, I'd like for you to take over an institution as warden." And when I got up off the floor, I said, "Boss, dude, man, I don't want to be the man. I don't want to be a turnkey." I really didn't. I wanted to be the good guy. I wanted to duke it out with the guys, you know, and mud wrestle and all that. That's what I like. And he told me what he had in mind, and I said, "Will you give me some time to think about it?" He said, "Oh, sure. Take 5 minutes." Well, I could have thought 5 months, and it probably wouldn't have been any different, but I went out. I took the 5 minutes, went out, prayed hard, and I knew that if I took that job, I was going to lose some of my first-person kind of relationship, you know, because when you're the man, you can't just be the buddy on the corner. If you're going to take it, you're going to have to take the whole deal. And then I thought, well, maybe if I had some authority and some power that I might be able to do some things. And so I agreed somewhat reluctantly and was installed as warden of a really glamorous installment. He and 2 or 3 other guys drove me about 50 miles away to a prison, took me in, introduced me to staff, said, "Here's your new boss." And then we walked out, and they drove off in the parking lot and left me standing there. And I said, "Wait, guys, wait. Don't leave me down here with these heathens." And so, anyway, that was my first deal. And that started a career, a part of my career that for about 20 years, that's what I did was operate institutions. My pattern was that I was the guy who developed new programs. I'm an out-of-the-box type of guy. I'm somebody who status quo would make me brain dead in a week. You know, if I develop a program, the next day I'm working on the next step. I think that way. And so I was a guy that had many opportunities during that phase of my career to do stuff, and it was a wonderful career. I finished it up by setting up a first-class drug and alcohol program, and I've worked 10 years past my retirement because it was such an exciting opportunity to do something really worthwhile. And so I retired, and if you ever want to know how to retire, I'm your guy to talk with. I retired, I think it was the 1st of December of some year, 2 years ago, and I had already been elected to be the AA Correctional Facilities Chair for the state the minute I retired. So I went right, the only thing I did is go outside the fence and start working full-time for nothing, you know. and I tell you, I wouldn't take $1 million for that. I wouldn't take anything for it. You know, I just tell you this, just think about this, that, you know, I see a lot of people, none whom I envy, who look at service needs and walk away. My belief is this. You know, when I walked out of that system, I doubt that there was anybody in this country who had more keen awareness of the problems of alcoholics in prisons. Nor was there anybody that had better access to that system. And I honestly believe, had I been able to look at a need like that I was capable of dealing with and walked away, there would have been a huge price tag on that. And so that's kind of the way I approach it. And we've had a marvelous 2 years. I just finished up this week as my term ran out. And the new chair is in place, and for the next couple of years I'll probably ride shotgun for him, because we got some really good stuff going in the state, and no way I'm going to just drop it on him and boogie. I'm going to stay right in there. Well, God, I'm never going to leave anyway. It's just a matter of what I'm going to be doing. And so that's a big part of it. That's my primary mission. But I'm a mainstream member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm concerned about everything in our fellowship that impacts a drunk. I'm on an ad hoc committee right now restructuring our service committees in the state of North Carolina, all of our committees, because we just didn't feel like they had enough connection to the primary purpose at the group level. So I have the opportunity to participate in that, and we'll wrap it up next month and have it enacted by May, I believe, to totally revamp the way we do that. So I'm a mainstream member. Now, I'm a guy who has been enormously blessed with this thing. I'm retired, but you'd never know it. My wife says she's going to get me to go to work, so I'll slow down. And so she's given up. I lead a relative, well, it's a very, very busy life, but it's a very simple life, too. I live in a little old town. A lot of you guys know where I live. It's just a little still Mayberry. It's a little rinky-dink place. But it's a great place. And I'm a good citizen of that place. The local paper just, they kept wanting, they feature a citizen once a month. And they hounded me about that for a year. I thought, who the devil wants to know this junk? You know, I mean, we understand, but why the average guy on the street? And then finally I gave in, and they took up about half the paper with a long article about that. And toward the end of the article, the guy was talking about my educational stuff, and he saw a lot of checkered spaces in there. And he said, "That's interesting, the pattern you had in your educational track, in your military track." He said, "I know you're interested in alcoholism. Did you ever have a problem with that yourself?" I said, "Oh, yeah. That explains my career pattern." And he said, "Well, I'd love to tell that story." I said, "That'd be another article. That's a different deal." But it's a marvelous kind of, that's why I say I'm the most rewarded guy in the United States of America, and I really believe that. I want to leave you with this thought, that I'm an enormously active member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm the busiest guy I know. But I am a fundamentally grounded sort of a guy. And when you're as busy in the program as this, and I know some of you are, the reason I want to just mention this, I know some of you are. When you're really busy in the program, you can't help having conflict feelings about, you know, what price am I paying for this? You know, if you got a young family and all this kind of stuff, you know, if I'm really involved in AA, how can I balance out my life so that I'm not robbing one to take care of the other? And it's really a kind of an important distinction to work through. I can tell you this, that there's a real difference between frantic activity and committed action. A very important distinction in that. Activity is just sort of scrambling in all directions, and I've done some of that. But committed actions are things to which I'm solidly committed, like a home group. That's a commitment. That's not under the heading of nice to do. That's not negotiable. That is not up for grabs. My sponsorship is a commitment to my sponsor and to those I sponsor. Those are commitments. Some service things, if I take on a job, I take it on to do the very best I can. That's a commitment. And there's an important distinction. I'll give you just one example to tell you what I'm talking about, why that's so important. And what is it that keeps you from getting into a lot of trouble with your family or employers or something like that. My son is a nice young physician. He's finally started to make money, thank God. He came down to visit, and he said, I want to take you guys out to dinner tonight, since I'm now self-supporting. I said, well, that's great. We'll go somewhere really. But he looked at me and he said, oh, wait a minute. This is meeting night, isn't it? I said, yeah, it is. Well, and he said, no sweat, we'll do it tomorrow night. Now, suppose I'd said, no, I've decided I'm going to run over here to a meeting tonight. See what I'm talking about? If I just put an activity as something that was more important than dinner with my son, that would have been a very bothersome thing to that fellow. If I tell my wife that AA has to come before anything in my life, I better be ready for a fight. Because that's flat wrong. My recovery comes first, not AA activity. A very important distinction in that. And so when I approach it that way, if I'm working Alcoholics Anonymous the way I want to, if I'm practicing these principles, this program will not compete with anything else in my life. If it's competing with something else in my life, I'm not doing it right. If it doesn't make me a better employee, a better employer, a better husband, a better father, a better citizen, I need to take a check and see where I'm screwing up on principles. Because I don't have to worry about sorting out and finding balance. If I just practice the principles, it'll help me to discipline my time and my commitments so that I can take care of business. And here, almost 46 years later, I can tell you this. I've been busy for a long, long time. And there is absolutely nothing in my life that I know of that has been negatively impacted in any way whatsoever. The most rewarded man in the United States of America.